Get out your flower crowns and put on your marching shoes because we made it to the 1960s. The golden age of white dudes singing at you with a guitar like Ken from the Barbie movie. Now, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement and other social movements that swept the country in the 1960s and 70s for a while, for the next few episodes. But before we do, let's back up for a minute to answer a really simple question. Why now? Why did various rights movements all seem to explode out of nowhere in the 1960s? Well, first of all, they didn't come out of nowhere, right? But there were a few factors that helped make the 60s a decade of unrest and social change. Now, of course, we can't underestimate the importance of World War II in this arena. A few episodes back, we talked about Black soldiers fighting for the double V, victory against racism abroad and at home. And during the war, the American population mobilized behind a common goal, finding new communities in urban areas that were growing thanks to wartime production, and the post-war world with Eleanor Roosevelt helping write the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, among other things. Globally, decolonization swept Africa and Asia as European empires fell apart, and Black Americans watched as new African nations were created out of the rubble of white supremacy. And meanwhile, some political changes at home helped too. The Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren, more simply known as the Warren Court, was quite liberal and handed down a few key decisions. In a few different decisions, the court asserted finally its principle of one person, one vote. Which begs the question, was that not the way it worked before? Turns out, no. In many states, districts were drawn based on area instead of population, so a chunk of rural land with 500 people might get the same representation as an urban area with over 50,000 people. What? This was probably a leftover from like the age of us as a nation of farmers, but whatever. The Warren Court changed that so that all voting districts had to be roughly equal in population. So all of a sudden, urban areas, which tended to be more liberal anyway, and thanks to white flight, they were now more diverse, all of a sudden gained way more political voting power. Meanwhile, the first boomers were reaching peak rebellious phase by 1960s. The boomers were an enormous population. They were young and they'd grown up during an economic boom. A much higher percentage of them were going to college where they would be away from the suburbs and exposed to diversity and new ideas. The boomers would have been the obnoxious young generation telling their parents how old-fashioned they were no matter what, because that's just how generational change works. But the boomers happen to have a lot of legitimate reasons to get out that righteous young adult rage through protest. Cold War interventions in foreign governments, the stifling of free speech in the name of patriotism, plus the looming potential for a nuclear apocalypse. And while not all white boomers got involved in the civil rights movement, I mean, not by a long shot, enough of them got involved that media attention, which only seems to listen when white people point things out, began covering the plight of Black Americans much more consistently. And so those homes in the suburbs were soon seeing Black people on their TV sets, sometimes performing on Nat King Cole's short-lived variety show, or more often being attacked by police, dogs, and fire hoses as they marched peacefully for equal rights. So there were a lot of reasons why civil rights seemed to explode by 1960. And really the golden age of the civil rights movement can kind of be tied to Dr. King's career. He first rose to national prominence as the voice of the year-long Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Although, shout out to Joanne Robinson, president of the Women's Political Council, who actually organized and sustained the boycott for the year. And just a few months before Rosa Parks was arrested, a 15-year-old boy named Emmett Till was brutally murdered, also in Alabama. And so for many, including people like a young John Lewis, these two events mixed together to mobilize a whole new generation of Black Americans. Organizations were founded, like the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which was formed with Dr. King as its first president. And they would kind of become the more established leaders of the movement, sometimes working with and other times kind of at odds with younger or more radical groups like SNCC or Black Power organizations. During his administration, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine to school, but that victory was fleeting. In fact, the following school year, the governor of Arkansas closed all of Little Rock's high schools for an entire year rather than continue integration. And the people of Little Rock overwhelmingly agreed. Almost 20,000 people voted to keep schools closed versus only 7,500 opposed. So the first wave of civil rights activism really happens under Eisenhower in the mid to late 1950s, but those victories were fairly localized, right? The Montgomery buses were desegregated, but nothing else. And the Little Rock Nine went to school that one year, but then most of them had to finish their education by correspondence because white people would rather have no school than have their kids go to school with Black kids. Wow. By the JFK era, starting in 1960, activists had grown more organized and they were thinking bigger, nationally. Many of the most iconic civil rights protests that occurred in the early 1960s were also organized by young college students, inspired by what they saw in Montgomery and Little Rock during those formative teenage years. In 1960, 4 students at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College sat at the whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's department store. By the end of that week, 300 students had joined them in the peaceful protest, and within 2 months, the sit-in movement had spread to 54 cities around the country, mostly college towns. And I want to note that these protests were peaceful, but that does not mean that the response was. People were beaten, dragged out of segregated establishments, and the mainstream organizations of the NAACP and the SCLC were nervous that maybe the young college students were getting ahead of themselves. Ella Baker, although she was in her late 50s by this point, worried that the SCLC, where she worked, was growing out of touch with the younger generation who was really motivated to move quickly. She actually put together a meeting of young activists that would become SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Also, can we just pause to notice that Black women are like the grassroots organizers of civil rights? It feels really important. Soon, SNCC chapters were popping up on college campuses around the country, but especially in the South. 1 year later, in 1961, many of those students would join the Freedom Riders. So in 1960, the Warren Court had ruled segregated public buses unconstitutional, kind of like they had with schools a few years earlier. But the South, of course, refused to integrate, kind of like they had with schools a few years earlier. You get it. So students would get on buses and ride them into the South, knowing that when they arrived at the bus terminal, they would at best be arrested and more often would be beaten by mobs of white supremacists and often police officers waiting for them. Like, for one example, in Birmingham, Freedom Riders were met with a gang of men with bats, chains, and lead pipes. And no law enforcement arrived to stop the beating because their commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, had given the police the day off for Mother's Day. Oh, right, and Bull Connor also told the local Ku Klux Klan to beat the riders until, quote, it looked like a bulldog got a hold of them. What a great commissioner on public safety Bull Connor was. And don't worry, Bull, we're coming back to you very soon. Meanwhile, in Washington, JFK had campaigned for civil rights, but he was also slow to actually propose legislation. Remember those pesky Southern Democrats who helped him barely beat out Nixon? Even though JFK did seemingly kind of turn his back often on civil rights activists pleading for massive federal action, he did take a lot of steps that really would be a big deal if we don't all now kind of compare them to what is going to come under LBJ. He's sort of in this way like the Herbert Hoover to Johnson's FDR. I mean, JFK brought 40 Black Americans into high-level government positions. He appointed Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer who had successfully argued the Brown v. Board of Education case a few years earlier, to be a federal judge, which paved the way for Marshall to become the first Black Supreme Court justice just a few years later. Kennedy's Justice Department, where he had more control than over in Congress, was way more active in supporting the civil rights movement. Run by his brother, Bobby Kennedy, the department filed lawsuits around the country, helping Black Americans register to vote, among many other things. But JFK really was the consummate politician. Like with the Bay of Pigs, he tried to have it both ways. He would say that he supported the Freedom Riders, but he also said they needed a cooling off period. You know, the exact wrong thing to tell someone who was rightfully angry. Just calm down for a little bit. Breathe. JFK negotiated a compromise with Southern governments who agreed to protect the Freedom Riders from violence, but they would still be arrested. Great. Thanks, Kennedy. I mean, by far, the biggest civil rights event during JFK's presidency was in Birmingham. Bull Connor was the paradoxically named Commissioner of Public Safety, and he was known across the Jim Crow South as a grade A racist asshole. That's historically accurate. When Dr. King and other leaders were looking for the site of their next big demonstration, they chose Birmingham because they knew that Bull Connor would respond with violence. And this is something that's really important to note about civil disobedience. It's not about just being peaceful. It's about putting yourself and your body in harm's way to bring attention to oppression, and then to not respond with violence, even when attacked. So the SCLC organized a series of sit-ins, marches, and protests to integrate the, quote, most segregated city in America. And the events were designed knowing that they would lead to mass arrests. When Dr. King himself was arrested, he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail defending their nonviolent tactics and calling out the white moderates who were more concerned with order and propriety than actually supporting the movement. You should really go read the entire letter. It's beautiful, and every word is still meaningful today. These protests lasted over a month in 1963, and as many of the adult protesters sat in jail, young people came out to take their place. James Bevel of the SCLC trained students from elementary school up through college in nonviolent tactics, and families across the country watched on their televisions as the children's marchers were attacked by police, sprayed with high-pressure fire hoses, and arrested. The escalating violence finally pressured JFK to propose a federal civil rights bill to address segregation. Just one day after this announcement, in Mississippi, a World War II veteran and NAACP field organizer, Medgar was murdered while organizing a voter registration drive. And the trial of his killer, a white citizens counselor, which is a group similar to the KKK, just highlighted the racism of the justice system, as all white juries repeatedly failed to reach verdicts. Civil rights leaders looked around and understood that they needed to take advantage of all of this national attention. Between Birmingham, JFK's announcement, and Medgar, they needed to take their movement to Congress. So in August of 1963, 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the famous March on Washington, where Dr. King would give his I Have a Dream speech, among many others. He wasn't the only speaker. By that point, though, JFK's proposed civil rights bill was already fairly watered down thanks to compromises with Southern Democrat segregationists who vowed to hold up the bill any way they could. But two events pushed Congress over the edge. First, in September, the KKK bombed Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 young girls aged 11 to 14. This was the third bombing in the state in the last 2 weeks since a federal court order had mandated the integration of all Alabama schools. The nation watched as Dr. King spoke at a memorial service for the young girls in front of 8,000 people. And meanwhile, nothing was being done to find the murderers. In fact, we now know that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had information about the identities of the bombers, but did nothing. And of course, 2 months after the church bombing, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Now, if you want to find deep dives into his assassination and all the conspiracy theories about it, go for it. You can find hundreds of videos on YouTube. For our purposes, for now, we just need to know that Kennedy was killed in Dallas, which was known around the country at the time as the City of Hate. And his death is going to be used masterfully by LBJ to push important civil rights legislation through Congress in his memory. The irony should be lost on none of us that the death of one white man arguably did more to get Congress to act on civil rights than the murder and oppression of millions of Black Americans over 350 years. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.